It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, by George, I think he's got it. Now, here's George.
Bring me on in there. There we go. It's Bleeding Heartland today, folks. That's right. Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome on in to another podcast by George live stream. It's another Sunday with Laura. God, I just love these. We've missed a few here, and I want to get her back on. We're going to have some fun today. There's some jaw-dropping news. Seems like there always is that Laura's covering, but this stuff might even make you laugh out loud a little bit, but I don't know if it's funny ha-ha or funny weird or just funny tragic. But by way of introduction for Laura, for folks that might be tuning in for one of the first times, Laura Belin is the editor-in-chief of Bleeding Heartland. It's a community blog providing original reporting and commentary about Iowa politics, especially campaigns and elections, state government, social and environmental issues. Bleeding Heartland also covers what the Iowans in Congress are up to and any federal, state, or local policies of interest to Iowa readers. Laura Belin has been the site's primary author and sole editor since early 2008, recognized nationwide as an authority on Iowa politics, the legislature, the judiciary, and of course, the governor's office. And it always makes me laugh because I think the only person that may not recognize her as that is, yeah, the governor's office, folks. Laura Belin is a true muckraker. She's rooting out details our elected officials would prefer remain out of public view. And they try to do that by stonewalling her public records request. We're going to talk about that a little bit. A muckraker. People ask me, what's a muckraker, George? Well, it's a term that's been applied to journalists for decades. And I don't know, it's, breaking the muck or digging up the details. And that's what she's really good at. I mean, Laura goes deep, folks. Now, in early 2021, Laura began working part-time as the State House correspondent for KHOI Community Radio in Ames. That's 89.1 FM. And I always have a soft spot for Ames Radio because I was the news director at KASI KCCQ a few decades ago, folks. She regularly appears on the program Capital Week. So let's see if we can take down the graphic here. Let's see if that comes down. Let's see if we can bring Laura in and say hello. Hi, how are you? And good morning to Laura Belin. Hi, Laura.
Good morning, George. Always good to be here.
Well, it's great to have you on. And I don't know, the news of the day, like I said, it's funny, it's tragic. I don't know exactly how to come down on this. I wanted to bring this article up because I think about this a lot in a funny way. And this is kind of a, just a jumping off point. But this is out of the News and Medical Life Sciences website. This is from the University of Colorado or Colorado University of Boulder. And it reads, as the 21st century progresses, rising atmospheric carbon dioxide, CO2 concentrations, will cause urban and indoor levels of the gas to increase. And that may significantly reduce our basic decision-making ability and complex strategic thinking, according to a new CU Boulder-led study. Now, this is a couple of years ago, but ever since I first saw this, I thought to myself, the CO2 is what they're blaming. It's largely to blame for the climate catastrophe that we're experiencing. That stuff's out there. It's indoors, it's outdoors, it's in the atmosphere. And when I see stories like we're going to be talking to Laura about today, I think the CO2 is affecting us already because we don't appear to be able to think any longer. By the end of the century, people could be exposed to indoor CO2 levels. The end of the century, I mean, we're talking 75 years from now, levels up to 1,400 parts per million, more than 3 times today's outdoor levels and well beyond what humans have ever experienced. Yeah, it's amazing how high CO2 levels get in enclosed spaces. It affects everybody from little kids packed into classrooms to scientists, business people, and decision makers to regular folks in their houses and apartments. Now, that's from Chris Karnauskas, a CRIES fellow, an associate professor at the CU of Boulder. I'm going to read through the rest of this real quick and get back to Laura. So put simply, when we breathe air with high CO2 levels, and some people would say we're doing that right now, folks, indoors and outdoors, the CO2 levels in our blood rise, reducing the amount of oxygen that reaches our brains. Studies show that this can increase sleepiness and anxiety and impair cognitive function. We all know the feeling. Sit too long in a stuffy, crowded lecture hall or conference room, And many of us begin to feel drowsy or dull. In general, CO2 concentrations are higher indoors than outdoors, the authors wrote. Okay, here's the last page. In fact, at 1400 ppm, CO2 concentrations may cut our basic decision-making ability by 25% and complex strategic thinking by around 50%, the authors found. Now, this is what they're predicting coming up in just the next few decades. And again, it doesn't happen all at once. I mean, this is linear, it's gradual. I think we're already seeing the effects of it. The cognitive impacts of rising CO2 levels represent what scientists call a direct effect of the gas's concentration, much like ocean acidification. In both cases, elevated CO2 itself, not the subsequent warming it also causes, is what triggers harm. We'll finish here by saying the team says there may be ways to adapt to higher indoor CO2 levels, but the best way to prevent levels from reaching harmful levels is to reduce fossil fuel emissions. Okay, so let me take that down off of the screen here if I can figure out how to get us back on. It's always a struggle with the technology. I don't know, Laura. It seems to me like I pick up the news and it's so depressing. It seems like we're in a race here to either melt the planet or blow it up. I mean, I don't know which is going to come first, but I wonder how in the hell did we get to this place? And maybe it's just the CO2. Maybe we've just lost our ability to think.
I don't know. I mean, I was talking last week and I spent some time with Mike Delaney, who's the founder of the Raccoon River Watershed Association. And he's a big activist on water quality,
Yeah, I've met him. Yeah.
preservation. He's a really great guy. And we were talking about how humans, we don't have very good long-term planning ability as it is. I mean, the Romans, there's research that the Romans basically burned through their topsoil in about 300 years. They didn't know, they were planting multiple crops every year. They didn't know anything about soil erosion. And they made some areas that had previously been very fertile, almost, areas that are barren that you couldn't grow any food on. And I mean, you can understand why that happened, but we have the knowledge of what happened to the Romans, and yet we've burned through, by some estimates, more than half of our topsoil in the last 150 175 years. So we haven't learned anything from their experience. And we're still dealing with a lot of the farming practices that are just sending massive quantities of the top, world class soil down the river to create the dead, to contribute anyway to the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So it's just hard to, I mean, I was thinking when you were reading that about, you were commenting on it's affecting some politicians' decisions. I remember this was, I mean, I want to say this might have even been before 2010. It was certainly more than 10 years ago, but there was a Republican legislator in the Iowa House, Dwayne Alons, up from Sioux County. And he said that we don't need to worry about global warming because we have air conditioning and refrigeration technology.
Yeah, my God.
I mean, just not even any understanding of what it could mean. As long as he's comfortable in his house, right? We don't have to worry about the planet warming. So there's just a big disconnect about how this could affect a lot of people, not just people who live in low-lying coastal areas.
We're going to talk about this a little bit more because we got an article coming up out of Bleeding Heartland. And folks, go to bleedingheartland.com and check it out because you might even catch a comment or two by a podcast by George there. It's a community blog. I mentioned that to begin with. I mean, if you've got an opinion, if you want to weigh in on these types of things, you can do it on bleedingheartland.com. You can do it on this broadcast too, by the way. I'm going to encourage everybody to use the comments section here on YouTube to pose a question or ask make a comment for Laura and myself as we move along here. But, you talk about the Romans before we leave that. There's, I follow this website called Them Hippies Was Right. And it, I mean, a lot of it is correct. I mean, coming out of the 70s, like me, I mean, I look at the world today and think if we had just done what the hippies wanted us to do, hell, if we'd have done what the Amish wanted us to do, we'd probably be better off. Well, the other thing about it is when you look at this news of today, everything that's coming down the pike, I always think, are they too dumb or are they in on it when it comes to these politicians? And this has a lot to do with this next article that we're gonna bring up here. And I'm gonna add this article. And again, this is in Bleeding Heartland. And Iowa GOP senator spreads hoax to justify school vouchers. And Laura, you can jump in here anytime, but I'm going to read through this very quickly. I wasn't even familiar with this guy. Republican State Senator Tim Crayenbrink spread a notorious hoax about litter boxes in schools at a public forum on May 7th. For days, he declined to apologize for his error or for his false claim that the media cover up the non-existent practice. So, I mean, they're marginalizing media, obviously. That's a part of the plan here, but they're demonizing media also. 7 superintendents in Crane Brink's district told Bleeding Heartland, that would be Laura, the senator has never contacted them regarding the rumors. So, okay. And it all came out of the Fort Dodge Messenger's Kelby Wingert covering the legislative forum, this thing that where they were talking on the record in full public view, folks, where Governor Kim Reynolds' proposed school voucher bill was a hot topic. Iowa Senate Republicans, including Crane Brink, have approved the latest version of the plan. Now, get this. I had to read this 3 times, Laura. They approved the latest version of the plan to divert an estimated $55 million in public funds annually to support private school tuition for 10,000 students. And I don't know, maybe it's a hot topic up there in Fort Dodge because they've got a big parochial school program in Fort Dodge. I used to live there, as a matter of fact. I mean, what's wrong with that sentence? $55 million in public funds to support private school tuition.
Yeah, I mean, it's really so to step back a minute. First of all, I do have to give credit to Kelby Wingert of the Fort Dodge Messenger, because I would not have known that this even occurred if not for her reporting. And she did try to follow up with the senator about what he meant by this, because his statement, it was really an outrageous statement. And when you say, are they too dumb or are they in on it? I would say in this case, he's definitely in on it. Tim Kreinbrink is not dumb. He is the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee. And so he knows, I think, that this he's trying to make a case for this bill and why parents should be able to pull their kids out of public schools. And so this was an example that he reached for. It's a hoax that was going around. The Carroll Community School superintendent had to send out a message earlier in the year. I found out this week that, in fact, the Humboldt Community School superintendent also had to send out a district-wide message about this, just to say it's not happening. There are no schools accommodating students identifying as animals. There are no kitty litter boxes in any school restrooms anywhere. And so this is just and instead of saying, look, I shouldn't have said this, I shouldn't have made this false claim in public, he said, well, I misspoke. And what I really meant, in a statement that he sent to the Fort Dodge Messenger a few days later, he said, what I really meant to say was that there was a school board that was asked to put litter boxes in the restroom, but they declined. And I mean, that's not true either. I was able to reach, in fact, after I published this, I was able to make contact with the last superintendent who hadn't gotten back to me before I published. And again, he confirmed hadn't come up. No one had reached out to talk to him. So it's just not happening. But again, a big picture view about this school voucher bill is that Governor Reynolds has been able to get almost her entire agenda through the legislature every year. She's had a Republican-controlled legislature every year she's been governor. But this school choice, or as she calls it, student first scholarships bill, she cannot get this bill through the House. It stalled in the House last year. They tried again this year. They tried to change it a little bit to make it more appealing to rural legislators. And there are anywhere from a minimum of 15 to possibly as many as 23 or 24 of the 60 Iowa House Republicans who won't vote for this bill. So that in itself is kind of remarkable. And so the people who are supporting the bill, like Senator Kreinbrink, they don't want to talk about the real reason why so many people oppose this bill. It would be terrible for schools, especially public schools in rural areas. So they try to create a distraction by saying, well, we need to give parents more ability to pull their kids out of the public schools because look at this outrageous thing that's happening in public schools.
I want to go a little deeper on there because this is insidious on a lot of levels. And I know that you looked at this very closely, but you mentioned the fact that this thing about animals or whatever, the bill started in the Iowa House. 20 or more Republicans said to oppose the plan. Senate Republicans responded by refusing to advance any state budget bills. What is retaliation? Is that what this is? A core area of Kreinbrink's responsibility as Senate Appropriations Chair. Is that what that is?
It's leverage. I mean, in Kreinbrink, I should say also, and I didn't get into it in this post, but this is something I covered last year. The Senate and House budget subcommittees for 50 plus years. I can at least 50 years and probably a lot longer than that. They have joint budget subcommittees where they meet throughout the session. They call in department or agency heads. They call in people like the people on the board of regents or the head of the state universities to talk about the state budget and their request and what's going on in the agency. So Senator Kreinbrink, the Iowa Senate generally just stopped holding any of these budget subcommittees in 2021. And they claimed it was due to the COVID-19 pandemic, like that they didn't want to hold any large committee meetings. I mean, that was a joke because the COVID mitigation at the state capitol was almost non-existent, as anyone who's down there would know. So this year, they don't even really have an excuse of the pandemic because they're doing even less mitigation this year than last year. But the Senate has just not participated in these budget subcommittee meetings. And part of that has meant that the Senate and the House are not easily in agreement on these budget targets. Like normally they would be done, they would be out of town by now, by mid-May, but they're not, they haven't even agreed, the House and Senate Republicans haven't even agreed on how much to spend in each area of the budget. And a lot of that is on Kreinbrink because he is the chair of the Appropriations Committee. So he's the one who should be scheduling all of these budget subcommittee meetings. So I have heard that the Senate is going to come back this week and they may start to move some budget bills, but I don't know whether that means that they'll be able to get the work on the budget done by the end of May. I mean, the Senate and the House are working on, there are several bills in limbo. The bottle bill is another one. There are a number of bills that either one chamber wants and the other chamber hasn't passed. And so in these backroom negotiations, that along with the state budget, that's all in the mix. But the biggest thing is this school voucher proposal, because that's what the governor wants really badly. She's been active in some of the House districts where Republicans have primary challengers, and she really wants to get something through the House, maybe a watered down proposal. But I keep hearing from my sources that they still don't have the votes for this thing in the Iowa House.
And maybe that's why Kreinbrink has gone out and made these crazy ass allegations and done this lying and all of this, because he knows that is such a linchpin for the governor. I want to continue with this. The actual quote here, I think that's what this is. He said, not in the Fort Dodge district, but in my Senate district, they're requiring these schools to put kitty litter boxes in the bathroom. The thing is, these things are happening in Iowa on a regular basis, and nobody knows about it because the media doesn't cover these things. Well, okay. And again, he's planting the seed. I mean, they're promulgating this, media thing that's going on, that they claim is going on, as well as the false claim about these litter boxes. It says, of course, the litter boxes have not been placed in any school bathrooms, like Laura says, in Iowa or anywhere else, nor at any schools accommodating students who supposedly identify as animals. All right. So now here's the thing. This is where we're going to start to get to the insidious nature of this. As others have observed, fear mongering about school bathrooms seems designed to stir up animus toward transgender people. Kreinbrink wasn't subtle. Wingert's account suggests. And again, we're going to go back to the coverage here. At one point during the forum, Kreinbrink, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that guy's name right.
I think you are.
Yeah.
I think it's Kreinbrink, yeah.
Told those in attendance that this bill is going to be easy to pass because of things happening in Iowa schools, like the Linmar Community School District in eastern Iowa recently adopting a policy allowing transgender students to use the restroom that aligns with their gender identity, which is a hell of a long way from identifying as an animal and putting litter boxes in the bathroom. But this is the kind of stretch of the imagination that's being employed here. And I think it's purposely to demonize this demographic, Laura.
Yes. And there's been in the right wing ecosphere in Iowa, they've been trying to demonize the transgender students for months. Of course, it's also tied up with that discriminatory sports bill that the governor signed in March. And Linmar School District has, for some reason, been a target. Linmar's policies on accepting transgender students, it's not unusual. It has been the policy across Iowa that most schools do allow students to use the restroom that aligns with their gender identity. So it's nothing new. I mean, the Iowa Civil Rights Act has has prohibited discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity since 2007. So, I mean, Linn-Mar did pass a new version of their policy, but there was nothing about that policy that was unusual. But people on the right, blogs, and some at legislative forums, and this isn't the only example where they've tried to hold up Linn-Mar, which is in the Cedar Rapids suburbs, as some kind of example of where parents are being disregarded. Of course, they don't say anything about the parents who support the policies, the tolerant policies in the school. So it is insidious. And unfortunately, it's targeting some of the most marginalized youth that we have in Iowa.
I'll take it a step further here. I think it is also victimizing the least among us in some ways that are the weakest minded. Now, I don't know how else to put that exactly, but I will hear from people, even with my small podcast, that'll come around and talk about these things that are crazy and on their face, obviously not true, that will be retracted and apologized for, like this dude is doing. But they go out into the ecosphere and they become fact, and people believe this shit. I'm telling you, they actually do. And this is a guy that you say knows better, and he's preying on the weak-minded in his constituency that will believe this and will promulgate it. And I'll tell you something else it reminds me of. I remember when early on in Obama's presidency, back when people were starting to use Photoshop on their home computers and put these memes on Facebook and all this type of thing, they were taking photos of Obama and removing the flags behind him and putting these on social media and saying, look, he won't stand in front of an American flag.
That's right.
And they also had I remember a photo of his wife and daughter on Air Force One or at a event or something like that. And they had photoshopped out a blanket and put an American flag on their lap and claimed that they were using the American flag, desecrating it by using it as a blanket. Obviously a crude Photoshop. Okay. Right. So this appears on people's Facebook pages, and I would bring them up short and say, well, you know, that's a Photoshop. Here's the evidence. You can see this for yourself. You know what their response was? I don't care. I like it.
Right.
What?
Right. Yeah.
You got taken in, you got hosed basically by this ridiculous precept. And you went around and you posted this in places, and instead of being angry that you were punked, you actually are good with it because you like it. And I look at what this guy's doing, and I wonder if that isn't in the same world a little bit. They know it's false. They know it's a hoax. They don't care. It furthers their cause, and it kind of makes them, kind of feel warm down inside or something. I don't know how. Yeah.
And the only bone I have to pick with the Fort Dodge Messenger is that when Senator Kreinbrink sent his follow-up statement, which was on Wednesday, this forum had happened on a Saturday, and he sent a statement, and they put a headline on the story that said, Senator apologizes for kitty litter remarks, but he really didn't apologize. If you look at it, the word apology was in there, but he wasn't really apologizing for misleading people. He said, I misspoke. And what I intended to say, and what I was told by a constituent, was a school board in this area was asked to place these boxes in its bathroom, but declined. And I know that's not true, because I've now heard from every superintendent in his Senate district that nothing like that ever occurred. There was never any request to put a litter box in the bathroom that was declined by any school board. I'm going to be submitting public records requests just to confirm that this didn't happen, and I'll be following up on it. But so that it is insidious, because he could have just said, I'm sorry, I should not have made the statement that wasn't true in a public forum. But instead, he tried to compound the falsehood.
I don't know, Laura. I don't know. I kind of get your closing comments on this, maybe, but I look at this. My God, these are elected officials. This guy, supposedly now on the national level, you're supposed to think of the Senate as the aristocrats, the people that kind of at the highest level. You got the House down there wrestling among each other on the House floor. But I don't know if that's true in the Iowa legislature. But you look at this guy, and guy's an Iowa senator. For God's sake, he comes out and does this kind of thing. My first question is there any ethics oversight in the Iowa legislature? I mean, this is a public forum. This guy came out and said something knowingly, you think, that was false, inflammatory, insightful, insidious. I don't know how many more other ways you want to describe this. I mean, is there any comeuppance for somebody that does something like this?
Yeah, the Iowa House and Senate have ethics committees. Their jurisdiction is very limited, and I've never heard of an ethics complaint. Most ethics complaints are dismissed quickly, but I've never heard of an ethics complaint over something like they said something that wasn't true in a public setting. I mean, the ethics codes, it would be more like using his position to profit personally. And even that is very limited. There was an ethics complaint filed against a different senator this year because he had intervened with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources to try to get a permit for a business that was associated with his son-in-law, I think. And that was not enough of a family connection because he didn't personally have a financial stake in his son-in-law's business. So that was dismissed for being outside their jurisdiction. So that's just very limited. But I want to say one more thing about the school vouchers. And this was some coverage that I had last week. And this is a different Republican Senator, Brad Zahn. And again, to your point of are they dumb or are they in on it? This is an example of being in on it because he had sent out in his legislative newsletter, he had this big list of bullet points of school choice, and this is why we need to do it. And then one of them was labeled for our caucus only, meaning that this was a comment that he intended to distribute only to the other Republican senators, but somehow it didn't get edited out of his newsletter before he sent it out to the public. And it was explaining how a wealthy family could take this scholarship money, a family that was already planning to send their child to private school, could take the scholarship money from the state. It can roll over whatever they don't use in 1 year, they can roll over in the future. So if they paid for their child's private school tuition from K through 12, and every year just pocketed the scholarship money, they could then use the proceeds to pay for college. And he said this could result in the state paying almost the full cost of their higher education. So obviously, I mean, the governor is saying that the school choice thing is going to be helping lower income people afford private school. But here's a Republican senator admitting that the program could be used by a wealthy family who was already planning to send their kids to private school to just save the money and use it to pay for college, which isn't anything the taxpayers of Iowa should be doing. If we're going to be paying for anyone's college, it should be for people who couldn't afford it.
Well, I've seen a little of Brad's on. I know you wouldn't say this, but I'll say it. It's a podcast by George. I think he's too dumb and he's in on it. I mean, this point of view is dumb. And then he was dumb enough to send it out without taking it out of his newsletter. And of course, that little axiom that I use, and I show the film clip. I won't show it because it's somewhat profane, but that line that I use all the time on Podcast by George, are you too dumb or are you in on it? That comes out of Robert De Niro's movie Casino. And if you look at that closely, there's a scene in it towards the beginning, I think, where his casino manager gets his machines rolled basically 3 times in a row. I think there were 2 consecutive major top line jackpots. And De Niro looks at that slot manager and he says, do you know what the odds of this happening once are? And do you know what the odds of it happening twice consecutively with the same players? You know what the odds of that are? It's astronomical. It cannot happen. And the guy says, well, you know, it's a casino. People got to win sometime. And he says, wait a minute. Now you're insulting my intelligence. Now you're either too dumb, you're dumb enough to believe that, or you're not too dumb and you're in on it. And in either event, you can't work here. And I like to apply that to politics. I wish people would look at that when they vote, look at that when they look at these representatives from the federal down to the very local level. I mean, either way, it doesn't make any difference. You're either too dumb or you're in on it. Well, again, I'd play the clip, but I don't want to get in copyright problems. So let me bring up this next slide. Anything else on that one, Laura, that you want to talk about?
No, I think we've covered it. So.
Okay, let me bring up this next one because this kind of follows too. Now, Laura corrected me actually when I created this graphic, and it has to do with a quote from our esteemed governor. I want my own AG, Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds. She's trying to get an attorney general that she can control. And it always reminds me, I like to bring this up. I talk about this on my podcast once in a while too. All the King's Men, the great Robert Penn Warren book out of the 30s, I think the early 30s, mid 30s, about the kingfish down in Louisiana. Huey Long, the governor down there, and how he ran roughshod over that state. And the kinds of things that he did. And I love that book cover, 35 cents a Bantam. That's a complete novel. You could have bought it for 35 cents back then. They made a movie out of it. It was a great movie as well. There's Huey Long in the center of the thing, and I mean, it's based on truth. I mean, that's kind of what you would call a documentary. Well, anyway, that's what Kim Reynolds reminds me of when she kind of pulls these stunts or tries to conceal what's going on in state government. That was all about Huey Long and the Kingfish down there in Louisiana. And of course, it was to the detriment of the people of Louisiana. They're still poverty stricken. He never did rise anybody out like he promised down there. And he eventually came to an untimely early demise down there, was shot. But anyway, long story short, I guess, tell us about this desire for the governor to have an attorney general that they can control.
So I have to, again, give credit to another reporters. This is WHO TV, the Channel 13, the NBC affiliate in the Des Moines area here, was covering Todd Simmons, was covering a campaign event last weekend. And he had caught a video of Governor Reynolds saying that we're going to keep Iowa red, make it redder. And she said, I want my own AG, please, and a state auditor who won't sue me every time they're trying to turn around. And he had the video. It's all on video. It even, in some ways, it even sounds worse than the way I described it, reading it out.
Well, Laura, sometimes, I don't mean to interrupt, but, you know, we talked about that too dumb or the in on a thing. Sometimes these politicians will claim they'll come back and backtrack and say, well, it was a joke. Did it sound like a joke to you?
No, and they didn't say that. I mean, I didn't hear back. Of course, I saw a comment from her campaign, didn't hear back, saw a comment from her regular spokesperson from her office. And he said, you'll have to ask the campaign because it was a campaign event. But no, she didn't walk it back as far as I saw anyway. And of course, the attorney general and the state auditor, they're separately elected offices. They're mentioned in Iowa's constitution. They shouldn't be under control of the governor. They're not under control of the governor. They don't report to the governor. And so the whole concept is inappropriate. But I think, and this is what I'm working on now, what's especially ridiculous is that Governor Reynolds already does exert a lot of influence over Attorney General Tom Miller's office, more than any of her predecessors, because 3 years ago, she strong-armed Tom Miller into agreeing basically not to join any multi-state lawsuits without her permission. And then after that, in 2020, she moved the person who was her senior legal counsel, Sam Langholtz, moved over to work in the Attorney General's office in the appellate area. And so Sam Langholtz is arguing most of the important political cases, whether it's related to the mask mandate ban, the transgender discrimination law, the one that said that people on Medicaid can't access gender affirming surgery. There have been other cases that he's argued before the Iowa Supreme Court or before federal courts. And so this is a job that really, I mean, he was literally her senior counsel. And those kind of cases traditionally have been handled by the Solicitor General, who's someone appointed by the Attorney General. And so really, she already has a lot of control over Tom Miller. I mean, he does act with some independence, but he doesn't have the independence that he really should have under the Iowa Constitution. But even that's not enough for her. She still wants her own AG. So a Republican. And the state auditor, I mean, it was the other thing that was comical about her statement was that the state auditor has never sued the governor. He has issued reports that were critical of how the governor's office spent resources, but that is the state auditor's job to audit other entities of state or local government, and that's what they do. I mean, the fact that the previous state auditor didn't really do anything to hold the executive branch accountable is not saying that the current state auditor, Rob Sand, is doing anything wrong. It's just that Governor Reynolds would rather go back to the old way where she never has to worry about what the state auditor is going to be looking at.
You know, one of the sharpest criticisms, at least from the left of Reynolds, is that she appears to be a Trump protege in a lot of ways. And of course, Trump, I mean, that was a lot of his presidency was fighting back and forth, wanting to get an AG that would go along with his way of thinking. Do you think that plays a role in this? Do you think she's, wanting to be like, same type of thing that Donald Trump wanted?
I mean, maybe it's certainly the Republican Party of Iowa has turned into the absolute rubber stamp Trump party. I mean, a lot of people say when the governor says something like this, they say, oh, isn't she angling to be vice president or have some national profile? And I really think that she just wants to be governor for life. I don't think she has any ambitions to hold any federal office. But this idea that, yes, there should be no checks on her power. I mean, that is kind of a Trumpian idea, but it may be that was already her instinct even before Trump. But I will say that her predecessor and mentor, Terry Branstad, who really, I mean, I didn't admire at all and didn't think he was a terrible governor, but he had experience working. Most of the time he was governor, the Democrats controlled at least one chamber of the legislature. And so he had a lot of experience with give and take and negotiating, which Governor Reynolds just doesn't have. So, and you're seeing it right now with this voucher bill that she's just trying to get through by brute force, that she doesn't have a lot of negotiating skills, and she just doesn't tolerate any alternate sources of power. And she's been very fortunate that this Republican controlled legislature doesn't exercise any oversight. And so the state auditor's office is one of the few areas in state government that is doing some oversight.
And I've told people earlier, go to, bleedingheartland.com and check out all of the posts. Now, you're going to have one on this. There's an article coming up on this.
Yes, I will. Sometime in the coming days. So
All right,
I'm
good.
also working on following up on the ways that the governor's office has restricted the attorney general from joining national lawsuits that otherwise he would have joined without this agreement that they struck in 2019, which really limited his power. I want to also put in a plug for KHOI radio. If people don't live in the Ames listening area, they can go to khoifm.org. And all of the programs can be listened to. So the whole archive of Capitol Week, which is my program, but really any of their local talk programs. They also broadcast some syndicated for the Radio Pacifica network, if you're familiar with
Sure.
Now, that show. And they really have a great variety of music and talk programming, and it's all available for free online at khoifm.org. But my co-host Dennis Hart and I discuss these topics and more in great detail on Capitol Week every week.
Well, the thing I love about it is that back in the day, I mean, they had community-based radio stations and that type of thing, but my God, you couldn't get them. But if you had an aerial, you might be able to get them 6 blocks from the station. But
That's
now
right.
they're on the web. You can get it in perfect clarity and get these great programs. And a lot of this is not available on commercial radio. So it's a great place to go. I would highly recommend it, as well as bleedingheartland.com and podcastbygeorge.com. Okay, let me bring this up on screen here because
All right.
I got asked about this again recently. And as I started off talking about, Laura she covers a lot of stuff that other people don't cover. And then every now and then she kind of is in the middle of it too. And this story has kind of become that. And I wanted to get the latest on it. The court rejects the governor's motions to dismiss an open records lawsuit. A Polk County District Court has rejected Governor Kim Reynolds' attempt to have an open records lawsuit tossed without being considered on the merits. It was the third time in the past 5 months that a court denied the state's motion to dismiss the suit, claiming the Reynolds administration violated Iowa's open records law.
Mm-hmm.
Laura writes, "I am among the plaintiffs who sued the governor and some of her staff in December over 5 unfulfilled requests I had submitted to her office, 2 requests submitted by Clark Kaufman of Iowa Capital Dispatch, and 1 request submitted by Randy Evans of the Iowa Freedom of Information Council." And people may recall Randy. We've had him on the show several times, Laura. But again, this is a story that you've been in the midst of, and kind of just give us the latest on what's happening here.
So this is, again, as I mentioned, there have been several lawsuits within the past year against either the governor's office, or one of them was against the Iowa Department of Public Health for slow walking public records requests. And so the pattern has been that shortly after the lawsuit was filed, the government entity then provided most of the records and then filed a motion to get the lawsuit dismissed, saying that this is moot now because we provided the records. So there is precedent. And it's mentioned, I posted the ruling, this Polk County District Court's ruling, and also linked to the other ruling. So there's precedent in the Iowa Supreme Court that says sometimes, even if a government entity does eventually provide records after they were sued, you can still say that that was a violation of the open records law if there was an unreasonable delay. But there were other points that the state was raising in this case that related to executive privilege and so on. And the judge just didn't find any of those convincing. So the next stage, they haven't announced it yet, but in the other 2 cases, the state did appeal those lower court rulings. And so if this one is also appealed, then the Iowa Supreme Court will decide just the issue of whether these lawsuits should be dismissed or whether they should be sent back to the lower court to be heard on the merits. So that would be a finding of whether, in this case, whether the governor's office violated the open records law. These were records. One of them dated back to April of 2020. I had several that were more than a year old. Clark Kaufman's request, I think, dated to early 2021, and Randy Evans was from the summer of 2021. And in all of these cases, none of us had received any records until a few weeks after the lawsuit was filed. And then they released many of the records, not quite all of them, but many of them.
Now, am I right? I think I saw some, maybe it was in Bleeding Heartland, but didn't Reynolds or her office offer up some kind of weasel word excuses for their not being able to or not being willing to fulfill these requests?
Well, there was, I mean, what they said in the briefs that the state filed was that the delay was due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So, I mean, there were the requests, some of them were for a lot of material and some of them were for a very small amount of material. So, and you know, that's something that the court, if they're looking at the case on the merits, then the court would start to consider questions like that. Like, really, was it true that the governor's staff just really didn't have time to produce these records between April of 2020 and January of 2022 because of the COVID pandemic? So, but at this stage, the state is still just trying to have the lawsuits dismissed, this one and others, without a court even considering the merits of any of the arguments.
Well, the ultimate irony here is Kim Reynolds would be the first to go on record and run around the state without a mask and tell everybody, hey, it's over. We're open for business. Let's go. Everybody on board. Well, okay, let's get these requests fulfilled. Let's get this information out there. I mean, that COVID response just doesn't hold any water, particularly coming from the governor's office. I don't know. I look at this and I think to myself, again, you got to set aside your partisanship. It's hard for me to do once in a while, but I wouldn't care if this was a Democrat or Republican when it comes to these open records requests. I want this fulfilled. I want this transparency out there. This is the public good, the public interest that we're talking about. If this were a Democratic governor doing this, I'd be on the same podcast bitching about this, just like I am with Reynolds. And it brings the bigger question up. I got to ask you, Laura, what is the motive here? I mean, are they trying to shut down journalists? Are they trying to prevent people from finding out what's going on? And to what end? What kind of a world are they envisioning here where this type of logic would prevail?
Well, I can't really, I can't speak to their motives. I mean, it certainly felt to many of us during the pandemic, it felt like a lot of our requests were being slow walked or just ignored because they didn't want information getting out that could be damaging. I mean, the Iowa Department of Public Health, I don't know, but the Iowa Department of Public Health was very slow to deal with records requests. And then in many cases, Clark Kaufman has written about this before, where he requested correspondence and they would say, well, providing those emails will cost $8,000 or $10,000, some kind of ridiculous amount that no reporter or news organization really is going to be able to pay.
I'm not gonna, yeah.
And I think it was, some of those, for instance, he was trying to get communications between Dr. Padati, who was the state medical director at the time, in the governor's office. And it's possible that there could have been explosive material in some of those records that they didn't want getting out. I mean, I have been filing public records requests to the governor's office for a long time. So I was very surprised when the pandemic started that they were so slow, because I had never had to wait more than probably a couple of months. I mean, sometimes government agencies are slower than we like them to be in filing records requests, but I hadn't had to wait that long. And so this to me was new.
When I see something like this, I always follow the money, George, follow the money. Well, I'm not capable of doing that. Laura is capable of doing that. But I also look at it and think, follow the litigation, the possible litigation. Are they not wanting to reveal this information because they think it can be used against them legally by some, lawyer Sharpie that will see the journalist reporting on this and take them to court and bring them down maybe that way? Is that a stretch, do you think, or is that a part of it?
I just don't know why it was so hard and they were so slow to get the records out. So that, I mean, of course, that's not an argument that they've made. So it'll be something, if if it ends up going to trial, I guess that would be the kind of thing that would be that they would be asked about during, and if there ever were a trial or if there were discovery related to a trial.
Well, we've got some reporting out just this past week. I know you'll be following this as well. I'm going to have a podcast by George devoted to it, basically, but it's about this memorandum from Tyson
Mm,
on the meat packing plants and how this was a draft that basically was used by the Trump administration to put that order in that kept those people on the line at these meat packing plants. And this is a real jaw dropper, a real eye opener. I'm going to have that on here in just a couple of days. And again,
yeah.
this is the kind of reporting that if you can get it out there, if you can get access, if you can get a leak, if you can get a memo, if you can get the open records revealed, you can let people know about what in the hell is going on. And we need more of this, and certainly not less. And it looks to me like Reynolds and her cronies, and I entitled this podcast Kooks and Cronies. We started off with the kooky litter box thing and the cronies thing,
Mhm.
trying to shut down these types of revelations that people need to know about if they're going to stay healthy and wealthy, and in some instances alive.
Yeah, that reporting on Tyson, I mean, it was incredible. It was sadly not surprising. It's not unusual that corporate, when they talk about corporate capture of government agencies, this is exactly the kind of thing,
Yeah.
and that the corporation literally writing, in this case, an executive order, but in other cases, writing regulations, submitting those to the agency and having those adopted by a government agency. It's happened at the state and federal level before. And in this case, I mean, people died in the early months of the pandemic. The contact tracers in Black Hawk County, so there's a huge Tyson plant in Waterloo, and they were saying that 90% of the early COVID cases could be traced back to that plant, either somebody who worked at the plant or somebody, a household member of somebody who worked at the plant. And so those meatpacking outbreaks really seeded massive outbreaks in the broader community.
Well, um, again, I'm looking at God. I can't believe how quickly time gets away from us. I'm a big full disclosure guy on both sides of the political spectrum. Have you heard this one, Laura? Now, this is federal, and it kind of sounds very similar to me. There's this accusation that there was a memorandum leaked from the Obama administration when he was coming into office, and that his entire cabinet was handpicked, coincidentally, by Citigroup, that they submitted a memorandum to the Obama administration. Now, maybe they just were lucky, but they named his cabinet top to bottom in this recommendation from Citigroup for a
I have
cabinet.
not seen that.
And that's exactly who ended up being selected. Well, okay, folks, you can
That's
Google that
amazing,
one.
but I do remember I remember when Bill Clinton was elected, and Clinton and Gore campaigned on putting people first in 1992, and I do remember that during that transition period, that big Wall Street companies got to the transition team and tried to say that this agenda that they were pushing was going to be bad for the bond markets,
Mm,
and they really got Bill Clinton to walk back a lot of the
yeah.
campaign promises in that area. So, I mean, it's again, it wouldn't shock me. I have not heard about anything like that Citigroup memo with the Obama administration, but definitely major Wall Street firms do try to intervene with Democratic as well as Republican administrations.
Well, look it up, folks. Support journalists like Laura Belin, my God, out there doing this muckraking reporter. Support full disclosure. Support these open records requests. Support Julian Assange. That's what I always tell people sitting in that prison in Belmarsh, because, again, he was publishing. A lot of people want to dispute that, but he was revealing on the internet leaked documents, war crimes, really. And that's a subject for another podcast. And you can go back into my archives and find episodes devoted entirely to that. Well, before we run out of time here, Laura, anything else in closing that I didn't touch on that you kind of want to, because we haven't talked for a couple, 3 weeks at least,
Yeah,
probably. Yeah.
it's been a while.
Yeah.
No, I've been focused with the June 7th primary coming up. I'm going to be doing some more campaign coverage. Early voting is starting soon in Iowa, so some things about early voting. But yeah, I'm always interested in the state government stories. I do have some public records requests out there that I haven't received the records yet, so we'll see what I'm able to turn up.
Well, go get them, man. I really enjoyed these episodes. I hope you learned something today. I certainly do. Every time we talk to Laura, we do. And folks, our guest today has been Laura Belin from Bleeding Heartland. Now, it's a community blog. Go on there and participate. It provides original reporting and commentary about Iowa politics, especially campaigns and elections, state government, social and environmental issues like we've been talking about today. You can hear her on khoi.org. I mean, go on the web and check that out. That's coming out of Ames, and you can follow Bleeding Heartland and Laura Belin that way also.
Thank you. Yeah, khoifm.org.
Oh, FM. Okay,
Yep.
great. KHOI.
Thanks so much, George.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, folks. So we'll get back with her here again very soon. And folks, I hope you like Podcast by George. If you do, you can get us at podcastbygeorge.com. And I always encourage people to go there because this is on YouTube today. You can subscribe there. But if you're, on your phone and maybe you don't have your YouTube app open or whatever, if you subscribe to us on multiple platforms, you can get us whenever we go live. We're on Facebook and on YouTube live with the videos. And then the recordings are published, repurposed on a number of platforms available on podcastbygeorge.com. The audio can be heard on iTunes and Stitcher and the iHeartRadio app, Spotify. A lot of people, like to get Spotify. They stream that in their car when they're out driving around, and then you'll never miss a single episode. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.